Hi, I'm Arthur Versluis, Professor and Chair of Department of Religious Studies at Michigan State University in the College of Arts and Letters. And what I want to talk to you today about is how to build a really great paper. When you write a paper, just like when you build a house, it's really helpful to have a plan. If you were to try to build a house just by cobbling things together as you went along, you would end up with a pretty crudely designed building. And the same is true for a paper. What you want to do is think ahead. Essentially, when you write a paper, there are two structural approaches. One is to write an inductive argument. And inductive means that you don't really have a thesis until you get started, until you travel through the bulk of the paper and you kind of take some byways along the way, and you get to the end, and that's where you really outline your conclusion, your argument as a whole. And the problem with an inductive argument is that oftentimes your professor or whoever your readers are won't be able to follow you or won't want to follow you all the way through the meandering. And that, as a form of a discursive essay, often works pretty well for some kinds of arguments. What we're going to talk about today is a form of argument called deductive. And a deductive argument works like this. You first start with an introduction. You have a broad idea of the subject that you want to write about. And then you develop a thesis, an argument that you lead into. And so typically an introduction is a paragraph, sometimes it's a couple of paragraphs. But you don't want to go longer than that because you want to, in a deductive argument, give your reader a sense of what it is that you want to argue. And that's your thesis. Then early in the paper or early in what you're working on, you want to get the opposition out of the way. You want to admit something, acknowledge your opposition, acknowledge the other side. Acknowledge that there's a good point here or there, but there are also some counters to those points, and those you remove, because if you do that at the end of the paper, as people will often do, that's what your reader will remember, is your opposition, the counter to your own argument, and that doesn't work very well. So get your opposition out of the way early. Then build your argument, and you build your argument from the weakest to the strongest points. And the reason you do that is you're building really an insurmountable or an impregnable case. So you start with a weaker paragraph, and your paragraphs are signaled. You signal your arguments, which are extensions of your thesis. You signal the paragraphs with a topic sentence, the first sentence in the paragraph. And each of those first sentences gives you a sense of the direction of the paragraph and the point that you're trying to make. And then within each paragraph, if you're citing support, if you have documentation and quotations, you want to introduce those quotations, not with just repeating says, but using some synonyms, maybe orienting your reader in terms of what you think about the quotation. If you say Carl Jung claims something, it has a different connotation than as Carl Jung remarks. Because if you say as Carl Jung remarks, what you're saying is essentially you support him. And if you say claims, it has a very different implication. So you want to give some signals to your reader about the quotations that you're using as support in your individual paragraphs. Then between the paragraphs, you want to think about transitions, how to signal the next paragraph that's coming. Just like in a book, you signal the next chapter. So you build your case from weakest to strongest, and think about your topic sentences. And as you've made your case, think then about your concluding paragraph or paragraphs. And you might think about that, not if you think about the introduction as a funnel leading into your thesis, then the conclusion expands outward. What a conclusion does is give your reader a sense of what you've argued, what you've shown, what you've proven, because a paper is essentially an argument. And you want to have a concluding remark, a kind of punchline at the end that expands out, maybe beyond the subject of the paper, and that has a little extra punch to it. You also want to think Are there any logical fallacies in what you're arguing? Are there errors of logic? A fallacy is something that sounds true, but it's actually false. What you're doing is really misleading your reader and creating a kind of false comparison that later can be overcome or rejected. So you want to avoid fallacies. And in building your case, you want to make the case as documented as is necessary. And what we're talking about here, this kind of overarching structure, starting with an image, concluding with an image, for example, having a kind of frame to your paper, is really a kind of overall structure that works for a book review, for an essay. It works for a book. What we're talking about is a kind of roof beam. Your argument is your roof beam for building a house, which is your paper. And you need that thesis in order for everything to hold together. And that works whether you're working for a corporation, whether you're working in a nonprofit or for the government. In any kind of situation in which you need to make an argument, this provides a kind of handy structure that you can move with and shift around as necessary, and it allows you to make a convincing case. In this video, what I've tried to do is give you some pointers on how to build structurally a really great paper.